According to a survey by Ipsos Malaysia, as concerned about the COVID-19 outbreak fate, Malaysians are now more worried about inflation. According to a research titled What Worries Malaysia, the percentage of Malaysians who said they were concerned about COVID-19 has decreased from its peak of 85% in April 2020 to 31% in May 2022. The percentage of respondents who are concerned about inflation has increased to 27% this month, the highest level since the survey's data collection began in April 2020. Malaysia's recent rise in food price drew media attention. Numerous factors contribute to this, including the pandemic's effect on labour shortage, supply chain delays, and rising commodity price. Weather-related issues have made matters worse. Effect of inflation. The rising cost of living in the current economic climate, which increased concurrently with rising average food price, has been discussed by certain economists. Due to the high rate of job losses brought on by the COVID-19 epidemic, lower-income households experience severe financial difficulties. The chief economist of Bank Islam Malaysia, Dr. Muhammad Afzal Nizam Abdul Rashid, asserts that a variety of causes, including increasing business expenses that are passed on to customers, are to blame for the increase in the cost of living. These costs include paying personnel, maintaining their property, and other overhead costs. The government is aware that rising inflation affects the cost of living of Malaysian families, especially those of low opinion. In this regard, various initiatives have been and are being implemented by the government in addressing inflation and rising price of basic necessities to reduce the burden of Malaysian family members. Through the 2022 budget, the government has allocated 31 million in subsidies, assistance and incentive, including subsidies for RON95 petrol and diesel, as well as cooking oil and flour. In addition, 200 million is allocated to help reduce the price of essential goods for the rural population. Other than that, the government will tighten enforcement on relevant legislation such as the Price Control and Anti-Profiteering Act 2011 to ensure that traders always conduct business ethically and do not take the opportunity to take excessive profits, resulting in increased price of goods or services. The government constantly monitors the price of goods, especially food, and take appropriate measures to avoid unreasonable increase in price, thus reducing the burden borne by the people.
Unemployment in Malaysia. In general, unemployment refers to individuals who are employable and actively seeking a job but are unable to find it. In Malaysia, during the COVID-19 era, the rate of unemployment began to rise when the first containment measure, known as Movement Control Order or MCO, was imposed. During this MCO period, only essential services such as food and beverages was allowed to operate but with strict operating procedure. The industry that had been affected the most are tourism and manufacturing, as both of the industry cannot operate due to order from the government. The statistic from the Department of Statistics Malaysia showed that the unemployment rate in 2020 reached 4.6% as compared to the previous year when the pandemic began, whereas the number of unemployed persons in 2020 increases by 39.9%, amounted to 711,000 persons as compared to 508,000 persons in 2019. High unemployment rate has reduced the capability of Malaysia in producing goods for trading. Matrix mentioned that in April 2020, the exports value also contracted by 23.8% at RM64.92 billion, while imports decreased by 8% at RM68.42 billion. The trade balance recorded a deficit amounted to RM3.5 billion in April 2020 after 269 months of continuous surplus. The statistics also show that the GDP or gross domestic product had reduced a lot as the unemployment increases. Tourism industries had been affected heavily by this pandemic, as the restriction of travelling and the closure of international border by many countries. Since the number of tourists had been declining, some services had been affected and was forced to close due to low or no revenue at all. Hence, many employees on the accommodation services, such as hotel, has to be terminated to reduce the company's expenditure. Chief Executive Officer of the Malaysian Association of Hotels mentioned that it had been revealed that at least 120 hotels had been ceased operation. Also, the numbers of tourist arrival in Malaysia declined by 83.4%, and the number of tourist arrival in 2020 is only 4.3 million, compared to 26.1 million people in the previous year. These are some of the measures taken by the government to solve the unemployment issue. The Malaysia's government had allocated a lot of money to sustain the problem and reducing the burden of many SMEs in Malaysia. One of the major programs done by the government is the wage subsidy program. It is to help employers to retain their workers, and the government really hopes the workers do not lose their sources of income.
Situation inflation in Japan during COVID-19. In May 2022, Japan's annual inflation rate is 2.5%, which is consistent with market expectation and unchanged from a record-breaking high in April. In May, core consumer prices rose at the same rate to April 2.1%. The Bank of Japan announced in middle of April that the domestic corporate goods price index had risen to its highest level since 1982. The central bank attributed the increase of 9.5% year-over-year to rising prices for crude oil and grain brought on by the nascent recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Energy imports were one of the most negatively impacted industries, with price for oil and coal rising by more than 27%. The result is that the investors are getting their money out of Japan. The central bank is producing more money to feed into the economy, and the yen is weakening against other global currencies. Before around 1980, Japan consistently had high inflation, and Japan experienced a surge in inflation at the same time of the first oil shock and had the highest rate among other developed countries. Effect inflation in Japan during COVID-19. Japan is not afraid of price increases as in other countries and has triggered inflation, which proves an elusive goal. The Federal Reserve and other goods centers have been fighting inflation. Bank of Japan wants to reduce corporate bond purchases to pre-inflation levels. In order to eventually achieve the 2% inflation objective, they enable the company to grow up quickly. Japan will continue to pour billions of dollars into the economy. For the foreseeable future, the Bank of Japan will continue to be one of the few central banks that won't tighten policy. When violent food and energy prices are not included, inflation in October was 0.1%. The economy shrank 0.6% in January to March and shrank 1.8% in October to December 2019. Solution inflation in Japan during COVID-19. Japan is reportedly considering launching an economic stimulus package worth about 100 trillion yen to help companies and workers affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Japan has recorded economic growth of 3.2% in the first quarter of 2020, and it has plummeted for the first time since 2015. Japan used private service, especially in face-to-face service such as food and drink and accommodation due to COVID-19 transmission. Japan also requests restaurants that serve alcohol and karaoke venues to shorten operating hours to close at 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. Japan has strengthened the border enforcement measure to prevent the coronavirus variant of concern.
Overview unemployment in Japan during COVID-19. In 2020, the unemployment rate in Japan was at about 2.97% and increased to 3.0% in August, the highest unemployment rate since mid-2017, reflecting the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the country's tight labour market. COVID-19 leads to heavy job losses among non-permanent employees. Workers from the services sector also contributed to the rising unemployment rate. The Japanese government also ordered non-essential sector to cease operation during a state of emergency in April. The health problems that hit caused the firm to be unable to operate to generate income and incur the cost of operating expenses such as employee salaries, which forced the firm to terminate the employee contract. So there is the problem of unemployment in Japan. Effect unemployment in Japan during COVID-19. The Japanese government faced economic pressure when most firms laid off workers, especially in the services sector, which relies heavily on part-time workers. Unemployment rose for the first time in 11 years. Automotive, tourism and public catering industry were among the industries most affected by the outbreak. The firm had to lay off current employees and contracts after the government declared its first state of emergency over the coronavirus. The government is asking people to stay in non-essential homes and businesses to suspend operation. This causes the firm to be unable to make a profit and cover the cost of the firm expenses. Widespread job losses and low consumer confidence will reduce consumption, leading to economic weakness. As a result, the world's third largest economy contracted annual rate contract by 29.3% in the April to June period in 2020 compared to the previous quarter. Employment in Japan during COVID-19 solution. Government gives short-time work compensation scheme. The system allows businesses to continue hiring retrenched workers by subsidizing a portion of worker wages. Government scheme that compensate workers for loss of income while they are in a short period of time. Second, work from home. During COVID-19 transmission, working from home helped reduce the risk of infection through a lack of direct contact between workers and those who could potentially be carriers of the virus.
The unemployment in Malaysia is different from Japan. The rate of unemployment is higher in Malaysia, while in Japan the rate is below 4%. The government of Malaysia and Japan also handle this situation differently. Malaysia's government conduct the economic stimulus by giving fund and many financial help to the SME and those who are affected during the pandemic. While Japan, on the other hand, applied the short-time work compensation scheme. The scheme is to help the individual who are affected by the pandemic by giving them financial help. For companies, government allow companies to hire their workers back, but they work lesser time and receive less payment. This is so that the government could avoid drastic recession during the pandemic.
Some inflation differences between Malaysia and Japan is, in Japan, the labour market is not as liquid as in Malaysia. As a result, in Japan, the number of people who leave their jobs did not show a significant improvement, especially that which happened to permanent workers, and constraints in terms of supply caused by the decline in the labour force participation rates have been limited due to a combination of the easing effect of reduced mobile phone charge in 2021 and a significant rise in energy price. The rate of rise in Japan's consumer price index jumped to about 2% in April. Despite this, there is a clear gap between inflation in Japan and Malaysia.
In conclusion, Malaysia and Japan are experiencing economic pressure due to the pandemic that began in 2019. Closure of the country's border affected economic activity between countries. Supply chain disruption affect operating supply, may also be responsible for higher operating costs and contribute to inflation. During the outbreak, government directive to close down part of the economy had an impact on the increase in the unemployment rate, when many businesses were forced to close. This suggests that the epidemic is having a major impact on the labour force. Therefore, it has affected the country's GDP. Despite all of the hardship both countries face, they are now currently building their own economy stronger.